Hello, this is Layli Miller-Muro, the Executive Director of the Tahirih Justice Center, and I'm going to try to explain a few things that have happened this week that have been very complicated and concerning to a whole lot of people. The first thing that I want to do is describe the process of vetting. There's been a lot of press discussion around the fact that the executive orders that were issued by the president were vetted or supposed to be vetted by the Justice Department before they were actually issued by the president. And so then when Sally Yates resigned as Attorney General, and now that law firms have been filed all over the country arguing that these orders are unconstitutional, it's been a little bit confusing to people because they thought it was vetted. But I think it's really important that people understand what the vetting process is. So I want to be specific legally, so I'm kind of turning to some of this. Okay. So the vetting process for executive orders is by two offices. It's by the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel and the White House Office of Management and Budget. So those are the two entities that are supposed to look at it. And they did, in fact, look at these executive orders before they were issued. But what's very important is the scope of what they look at. They're actually not asked to look at the underlying constitutionality of these orders, and they are not asked to look at the policy implications of these orders. So whether or not these orders are a good idea, whether they've been properly coordinated among different government agencies, whether they even make sense, is not what their job is. Their job is to say to the president that they've been drafted, okay, and that you have legal authority to issue them. So that's the whole purpose that is served by these two offices, the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel and the White House Office of Management and Budget. That's their purpose, is to look at these orders for that very limited question. The specific language is with respect to form and the legality of the fact of the executive order. The purpose of executive orders is not to make law, it's to execute law. So Congress's job is to make law. They're the only ones that can write statutes and pass legislation. It's the judiciary's job to enforce and interpret that law. And it's the president's job to execute that law. So in the executive orders, it can contain lots of broad stuff, but what it can't do is make law. So the fact that there are so many lawsuits happening right now around these executive orders reflects controversy in a few areas. One has to do with whether they're constitutional. The other has to do with whether they have, in fact, made law, which the president can't do, as opposed to a presidential execution of the law. And so what is legally challengeable about these executive orders is actually very important. And I'll just say a moment, you know, my job at the Tahirih Justice Center, I'm the CEO. And so my job is to do our work, to support our work, is fundamentally to allow everybody else at the Tahirih Justice Center to do their job. So I'm an enabler of everybody else's ability to do their job. A big piece of that is fundraising, and I do a lot of fundraising, because if I don't fundraise, other attorneys at Tahirih don't have their jobs. And of course, I have noticed, as many people have pointed out to me, that the ACLU has raised $24 million in the last week, which is 5 times the amount that they raise annually from individual donors. So it's great news for them and for the cause. But I do want to point out one thing. It's really good to bring constitutional lawsuits, which the ACLU does and is very good at. But these executive orders and their content cannot be fought that way alone, because when you read the executive order, there are bits of it that are actually constitutional. So the ACLU is going to win on some things, and then it's going to lose on some things. And in fact, these federal lawsuits take many years to litigate. And so meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be affected while these lawsuits are pending. And so that's my kind of explanatory plug for, in fact, funding organizations like the Tahirih Justice Center, who, while these lawsuits are pending, are also going to be advocating through Congress, because Congress, through competing bills, contradictory bills, can oppose these executive orders. They have to be veto-proof, of course, but there is congressional action that's possible to overturn some of what's in these executive orders. Also, people need to be helped and served on the ground. There are so many people who are daily being affected by these executive orders. So all this work is valuable. All this work is important, but federal litigation and what's going on there is only one of the battlegrounds. It's only one piece of that larger puzzle that many organizations, including the Tahirih Justice Center, are engaged in. So wanted to explain both the vetting process, but then also how much more needs to be done on multiple fronts in order to really combat the content of these executive orders. Okay, so back to what's in these executive orders. So one, and I've described before in previous videos that there are 3 executive orders altogether that affect immigrants and refugees. One executive order affects primarily people who are outside of the country trying to come in. That's what's gotten the most attention in the media. It's the so-called ban, and it affects, it holds off on immigration from 7 particular countries that are deemed high-risk countries. It bans anyone from coming from those countries. This includes Iran, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. There's 7 altogether. As I pointed out before, not one of those countries has ever inflicted a terrorist act. Not one individual from any of those countries has inflicted a terrorist act. In September 11th, there were acts of terrorism in the United States. And then since then, there have been a few more, but they have not in any instance been perpetrated by individuals from those 7 countries. In fact, September 11th was perpetrated by individuals from Egypt, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and none of those 4 countries have been banned. None of them. So these 7 countries that have been banned, even though no terrorist has ever come from them, it has had a profound impact. And what the executive order said was that non-immigrant and immigrant visas would be suspended from those countries. Now, this is where it has gotten really sticky, is that the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security have issued competing interpretations of that. So okay, so with regard to this ban on this one executive order, remember there are 3, and the 2 others, by the way, have an effect on immigrants who are here in this country right now. And at a later time, I can go into more detail about those 2 executive orders, because to be frank, it's those 2 other executive orders that the clients of the Tahirih Justice Center, immigrant women and girls fleeing violence who are here already in the United States, affect the most. But putting those aside and focusing just on this one executive order that affects people who are outside the country trying to come in, there is a 4-month ban on all refugees from every part of the world, everywhere, until extreme vetting measures are assessed and new ones are recommended. Which, for those of us who do this work and know that the United States has the most extreme vetting process for refugees in the world, only 1% of all applicants get through, and not one, it's worked, because not one refugee has ever committed a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. We're not really sure how much more extreme we can get on our extreme vetting, but that was one provision. And then these 7 countries, travel has been banned from those 7 countries across the board. The White House came out with a statement saying that permanent residents, which are green card holders, and that is a immigrant visa. So there are non-immigrant visas, which include things like students, people who come here to work for major international corporations. It includes a whole other forms of category. Those are included. And this is why universities are suing, companies are up in arms, because they are all affected by this. They can't do business, they can't educate people who are in the middle of their degrees. It's had a profound impact. But what has also affected are immigrant visas and green cards, permanent resident status, which it's the same thing. When you say permanent resident status and then you refer to a green card, you're referring to the status, permanent resident status, and then the documentation for it, which is called a green card. So those are the same thing. And the White House came out and said, oh, we didn't mean to include green card holders, even though the language of the executive order did. Then an internal memo that has now been made public widely from the State Department instructed all of its consular officers on the ground to include permanent residents or green card holders. Then the Department of Homeland Security issued a statement, made a public statement, General Kelly, at a press conference that said, no, it doesn't include green card holders. So we have a problem. We have a complete contradiction within really critical government agencies on how they're going to implement this. So to be clear, three entities are talking: the White House, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. The White House is the one that set the policy. Department of Homeland Security has primary effect only on those who are already in the United States. So they are also processing permanent residence applications and green card holders who are here in the United States. But the State Department controls visa issuance from outside of the United States. And it's consular officers at the border. And, you know, for those of you who have traveled, you meet them at airports abroad. And they affect whether you'll physically get your visa when you try to get it from a U.S. consular officer or U.S. embassy abroad. It's the State Department that controls that. So they are the gatekeepers on who can come into the United States. Department of Homeland Security, and I'm simplifying, is the gatekeeper for who can stay in the United States. And so it's very significant that the State Department believes that green card holders are included in the ban. And then it's really confusing that Department of Homeland Security does not think they're included in the ban. And that General Kelly has, in a press conference recently, articulated that. Compounding all of this is the fact that when the executive order was vetted, when it was reviewed before it could be issued, in addition to the office who's in charge of vetting it not looking at the specific policies, but only looking at the legality of the order itself, there was no coordination. So nobody at the Justice Department was able to look at the underlying policies. Nobody at the Department of Homeland Security viewed this before it went out, and no one at the State Department viewed it before it has gone out. And this I will say with our information, whatever they're saying publicly, we know for a fact, because of friends of ours who work for these agencies and who were directly responsible for reviewing things like this before they go public, did not see it. They did not learn that this was going to be coming out of the White House until after the press conference where it came out. So there's confusion, and so the agencies that have to implement these things were never consulted about them. So they weren't able to get their act together, if you will, about their mutual understanding of how these would be interpreted, and they weren't able to then deploy internal memorandum guidance in order to help people on the ground execute them. I know there's some things that are being said publicly, but from people who are working there, it is clear that they were without guidance. There was an interesting moment at the airport Tahirih has offices in San Francisco, Houston, Texas, Baltimore, and Washington. And we had attorneys on the ground in 3 of those 4 airports. One of our attorneys in one of those cities, and I'm going to try to protect the individual that I'm going to talk about, but one of them who does a lot of advocacy on the Hill, knows all of the high-level officers or political appointees at Customs Border Patrol, CBP, at ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, at Department of Homeland Security, and at the State Department. We know all the humans who are high-ranking political appointees there. One of our staff was at one of the airports, and there was kind of pandemonium. There's a lot of protesters. She had called local Congress people and gotten them all to appear at the airport so that they could personally help to advocate during this situation. And she described looking out at the crowd and saw someone who looked really familiar that she remembered from White House meetings. And it turned out to be a very high-ranking former Obama political appointee who worked. He had resigned about a week earlier for one of these agencies. He was at the airport with a sign protesting with his wife and his toddler. So he was now kind of on the other side. She walked up to him and she's like, dude, you still have security clearance. You can actually walk back there to secondary inspection at the airport and to Customs Border Patrol and find out what's happening for all of us. Would you mind doing that? And so he did. He took out his pass and he walked back there, and he was able to then, report back what was going on, both to the Congress people and to our advocates, and report that people were being held, people were being denied entry who probably should be let in, and all of these kinds of things. And he was able to confirm that there was no supervisor on duty, and that they were really confused about what they were supposed to do. And so, this example of nobody knows how these executive orders are supposed to be implemented, and this particular confusion around whether permanent residents, which is the same thing as saying a green card holder, from these 7 affected countries are supposed to be banned or not, is confusing. And so Department of Homeland Security has said they are not, and the State Department has said they are. Frankly, it is more consequential that the State Department has said they are, because the State Department believes that green card holders and permanent residents are supposed to be banned from coming back to the United States under these orders. And we know, and it's being widely reported in the press, that because they're the gatekeepers who control who gets on the plane or who is issued a visa at a consular office abroad, we now know that on the ground, how this is being implemented is in fact excluding green card holders and permanent residents. So I think the bottom line is that if you have a loved one or you yourself are affected potentially by this, do not travel. If you are a foreign national from one of these 7 countries, it is the wisest thing to do to not travel, because there's a likelihood, given the confusion right now and given the way that this is being interpreted, that if you leave the country, even though Department of Homeland Security says they don't think green card holders should be included in the interpretation, the State Department has issued public documentation saying that they think green card holders are included in the executive order. And so you should not travel because you may not be allowed back in the country. And I also want to address the rhetoric in the media which calls this a temporary ban. It is not. The order and the way the Department of Homeland Security, the way the State Department is interpreting the order, is it is a revocation of visas. Revoking visas is very different than temporarily banning. So when your visa is revoked, you have to reapply for it. And so if you are a student, for example, it may have taken you 6 months to get that visa. If it is revoked, it will take you another 6 months. And that was in a previous era when things were functioning a little bit better. So it could take even longer. If you have permanent residence and that is revoked, it will take you a very long time to reapply, submit all your documentation. You have to submit all of your evidence again. You have to again wait for your interview process, your biometrics to come through. That's a nightmare. And that is not just 3 months. So visas are being revoked. That is very different than a temporary ban. So again, if you're from these 7 countries, I advise you not to travel. It is confusing though, and there are conflicting things right now, clearly, that are being said by Department of Homeland Security and by the State Department. Also, to be clear, for green card holders who are in the United States, you are okay. Just don't travel. That's the only thing. Don't travel. But if you have a green card or permanent residence and you're here in the United States, according to law, and for any of you who cares, it's section 221 subsection I under the INA. The authority to revoke a permanent resident status by the State Department only resides with them for people who are outside of the country. They cannot take away, the State Department cannot take away your green card if you're already in the country. So while their interpretation of the fact that immigrant visas, including green cards, are included under the executive order, they only have power to execute that if you're outside of the country. They can only revoke your green card if you're outside of the country. If you're inside the country, law states that only only an immigration judge can revoke your green card. And that's a judicial process. So again, to summarize, if you're outside of the country and you're from one of these 7 countries, you are at risk because of the current interpretation of the State Department of having your permanent residence or green card revoked. And if they do that, there is no judicial review possible. The law that I just cited gives complete discretion by consular officers to revoke permanent residence or green cards if you're outside of the United States, and it's unreviewable discretion. And then there's some exception having to do with impact and whether or not removal proceedings have started as a result of that may in turn allow for adjudication of that order. But in layman's terms, the simple view, which for lawyers watching, they'll cringe because they're like these exceptions and subsections that have some exceptions. But the summary, simple view of it is that the State Department can do that, and you might lose your green card. If you're in the United States, though, there's a whole judicial review process that you have access to. And in any case, the Department of Homeland Security, which is domestic as opposed to foreign, is not interpreting this executive order as including permanent residents or green card holders. So you're okay. If you're here, you're okay. If you're abroad, there's real risk. And if you're from one of these 7 countries and you have anything, you have an immigrant visa, a non-immigrant visa, or a green card, it is really the safest thing to do to not travel. The good news is, and this is not a statement on who has just been made Secretary of State, but the good news is that we now have a Secretary of State. So from a management perspective, a lot of this chaos is being born from the fact that the White House is not consulting the agencies that are most affected. And so there's confusion by those agencies when these orders come out and they don't understand the meaning of them. They're not clear on the interpretation of them, and they have not planned for the implementation of them. There has been, in addition to confusion coming from the lack of consultation, there's confusion coming from the lack of leadership. So where there is not clearly someone in charge at these agencies and someone who can quickly consult with the president and get clarity, there has been widespread management confusion internally, kind of top down, on how to implement these orders and how to interpret them. So I think that this will become clear. I think that the current disagreement or inconsistent interpretation that we have between Department of Homeland Security and the State Department should become clear maybe over the next few months when they have an opportunity to talk to each other, they have an opportunity to better coordinate. Then they'll have to issue more internal memos in order to tell people on the ground how to implement, and this will become more clear. The policies are still bad news, but the current chaos that's erupting, particularly with regard to the implementation of this for green card holders and permanent residents, I think will get a little bit more clear going forward. I think, and then someone mentioned also the airlines. This is another thing. There is an internal process that has not been abided by, that when there are changes like this, the airlines are supposed to let them know about it. And that also didn't happen. So in addition to the confusion on the ground by CBP, consular officers, DHS, ICE, and all the people who have to implement these things, the airlines themselves have been confused. And so whether or not people have been able to get on the airplane sometimes is being vetted by the airlines themselves, because under law, airlines are legally liable for allowing people to board who don't have valid travel documents. So this is why you have to hand over your passport and your visa stamp to the airline, because they know, and there's actually a whole court process. When I used to work at the Justice Department, my office at the Board of Immigration Appeals was just a floor above the office whose whole job was just to penalize airlines. And so airlines are kind of an extension, or they're a defense line for helping people not come into the country who don't have proper visas. And so the airlines need to be communicated with as well, and they also weren't coordinated with. So I hope all of this will become clear. I'm sorry that there's not a black and white, very clear yes and no answer for permanent residents and green card holders coming from these 7 countries. But the messy answer is that there are 2 different interpretations coming out of State Department and Department of Homeland Security, and just to be safe, you shouldn't travel. Some of you may have already seen in the press, but over 100,000 visas have already been revoked because of this, because of the confusion, but then because of also the non-confusion, where the executive orders clearly said that certain categories of visas would absolutely be revoked. And for those 100,000 people, this is not temporary. This is not 3 months. This is permanent, because now they have to reapply for those orders. That number, by the way, came out because it's not a widely known number, so I want to be accurate with you in where it came from. That 100,000 visas have been revoked from predominantly Muslim countries, from these 7 so-called banned countries, came out during litigation. It was Mr. his name is spelled Reuveni, Revuni, from the Justice Department Office of Immigration Litigation, said this in court in the context of the lawsuit that was brought on behalf of 2 Yemeni brothers that were then sent to Ethiopia. Tariq and Ammar Akel Mohammed Aziz. They tried to enter the country and then were sent back. A lawsuit was brought on their behalf in Alexandria, and it was in the process of those court proceedings that the government revealed how many visas have been revoked. And what seems to be happening is, for those who have experienced the revocation of their visas from these 7 countries, there is an attempt, where those people have lawyers and where there has been media scrutiny in those cases, to, on a case-by-case basis, reissue the visas. There's a huge problem with that it's not merit-based, it's not objective, and there's no procedure for it. It just has to do with how much noise you're able to make. So that's the lay of the land. That's what we're living with right now. And meanwhile, we're still scrambling to help people. People are very afraid. People don't know what's happening, not only from these 7 countries, but from many countries. Tahirih's phones have been ringing off the hook from people who are scared and need assistance. We have launched a fundraising campaign on Facebook that you can contribute to, but then also just among our supporters. And so again, if you feel moved, please do support our work. We're on the front lines working both with direct immigrant communities who are affected in our offices in San Francisco, Houston, Texas, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. But we're also litigating, we're advocating on the Hill, with the White House, with Congress, with the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and ICE in order to try to remediate at a structural level what these policies are. So thank you for your support, and if you have, I'm sure there'll be more issues in the coming days that raise confusion and that people need assistance with, and I'll try my best to try to help and clarify and support people during this really difficult time. So thank you again. I hope you have a good weekend, and I'm personally praying for less bad news in the days to come because I need more sleep, and the Tahirih Justice Center staff are needing more sleep right now. Thank you.